Mom's $12 million archive went to whoever cracked her filing system. They used AI analysts. I remembered her secret code word. Mom died at 3:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in September, collapsing in her home office surrounded by filing cabinets that contained 40 years of investigative journalism, corporate whistleblower documents, and evidence that had put 17 executives in prison and cost corrupt corporations over $800 million in fines and settlements. Her name was Dr. Vivian Reeves, and the New York Times obituary called her the most dangerous woman in American journalism. The coroner ruled it a cerebral aneurysm, sudden and catastrophic, though I spent the first 3 days after her death wondering if someone had finally succeeded in silencing her. She'd received death threats for decades, anonymous messages promising violence if she didn't stop exposing powerful people's crimes. The funeral happened on Saturday with 200 journalists, lawyers, and activists in attendance, people whose careers she'd made possible by teaching them how to find truth in systems designed to hide it. My 3 siblings arrived in tailored mourning clothes and calculated expressions, already strategizing about the inheritance before we'd lowered her casket into the ground. My oldest brother, Nathaniel Reeves, flew in from Silicon Valley where he was CEO of a data analytics firm worth $340 million. His PhD in computer science from Stanford had led him to pioneer machine learning algorithms that predicted consumer behavior with 93% accuracy. He'd been featured in Forbes, TechCrunch, and Wired as one of the tech industry's most innovative minds, building artificial intelligence systems that could process billions of data points in seconds. My sister Victoria arrived from Washington, D.C., where she worked as a senior partner at one of the country's most prestigious law firms, specializing in corporate litigation. Her Yale law degree hung in her corner office alongside photos with Supreme Court justices and senators, her reputation for destroying opposing counsel in depositions legendary in legal circles. My younger brother Dominic came from London where he directed a private equity fund managing $2.3 billion in assets. His MBA from Oxford and his instinct for identifying undervalued companies had made him wealthy beyond anything our middle-class upbringing had prepared us for. Then there was me, Iris Reeves, the family disappointment with a master's in library science from a state university and a job as a municipal archivist making $52,000 annually. I lived in a studio apartment in Queens and took the subway to work every day, organizing historical documents for a city government that barely funded my department. The will reading happened on Monday at Mom's attorney's office in downtown Manhattan, a glass tower where the receptionist looked at my Target dress with barely concealed disdain. The attorney, a woman named Helena Marsh, who'd worked with Mom for 26 years, had the weary expression of someone who'd spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money. She opened the leather folder containing Mom's final wishes and began reading in a voice that suggested she'd memorized every word. To my children, I leave my personal archive, currently housed in my home office and storage facilities in Brooklyn. The collection contains approximately 847,000 documents, 12,400 hours of recorded interviews, 6,700 photographs, and 340 bankers' boxes of evidence files accumulated over 40 years of investigative journalism. The archive has been valued by independent appraisers at $12.3 million, representing both historical significance and ongoing legal relevance. However, this inheritance comes with specific conditions that must be met within 72 hours of this reading. Helena paused and looked at each of us over her reading glasses, measuring whether we understood that something unprecedented was about to happen. Mom created a challenge based on her filing system. The archive is currently organized using a method she developed over decades, a system that appears chaotic to outsiders but contains precise internal logic. Before her death, she encrypted all digital indices and removed all traditional organizational markers from the physical files. Whoever can locate and retrieve 3 specific documents from the archive within 72 hours inherits everything. The others receive nothing. The room erupted immediately. Nathaniel stood up, his tech executive voice commanding attention. What are the 3 documents? What's the retrieval method? What organizational system are we working with? Victoria was already pulling out her phone, fingers moving across the screen. I need the legal precedent for this type of testamentary condition. Is this even enforceable? Can we challenge based on impossibility of performance? Dominic leaned back in his chair, analyzing the situation like an investment opportunity. What's the actual market value if we sold the archive intact versus liquidated the individual components? What are the carrying costs during the 72-hour period? I sat quietly while my siblings talked over each other, feeling the familiar sensation of being invisible in my own family, the one whose opinion didn't matter because I didn't have the right credentials or income level. Helena raised her hand for silence and continued reading. The 3 documents are as follows. First, the original recording of the Whitmore Pharmaceutical interview from November 1987 that led to the recall of their cardiac medication and $340 million in settlements. Second, the handwritten confession from Kenneth Ashford admitting to orchestrating the pension fund collapse that destroyed retirement savings for 14,000 workers in 2003. Third, the photographic evidence showing Senator Harold Dennings accepting cash payments from defense contractors in exchange for votes on military spending bills in 2011. Each document is currently somewhere within the 847,000 items in the archive. You must physically retrieve all 3 and bring them to this office within 72 hours. Nathaniel laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. That's impossible without the organizational system. Even with advanced search algorithms, we'd need to process nearly 1 million documents in 3 days. There has to be an index or catalog. Helena shook her head and handed each of us a sealed envelope. These contain your access credentials to Mom's home office and the Brooklyn storage facility. The countdown begins the moment you open the envelope. You must work individually, no teams, no hired assistants, no AI analysis or machine processing. Any evidence of outside help results in immediate disqualification. Mom has installed surveillance systems to monitor compliance. Victoria's lawyer instincts activated immediately. This is unconscionable. We're professionals with demanding careers. How are we supposed to dedicate 72 consecutive hours to searching through a disorganized archive? It's designed to be unsolvable. Helena pulled out another document. Mom anticipated that objection. She included a provision stating that she spent 40 years inviting each of you to learn her filing system, to work with her on investigations, to understand her methodology. She kept detailed records of these invitations and your responses. Would you like me to present that evidence? The room went silent. I knew what those records would show because I'd lived it. Mom had asked Nathaniel hundreds of times to help organize her digital files, offering to teach him her system. He'd always been too busy building his company. She'd invited Victoria to review legal documents with her, to learn how she cross-referenced evidence. Victoria had declined because she was working on high-profile cases. Dominic had been offered opportunities to understand her investigative process, to see how she tracked financial crimes. He'd chosen to focus on his own investment strategies instead. Helena looked at me then, and something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. Iris, your mother left you a separate message. She asked me to tell you that the filing system is exactly what you think it is. The others won't understand, but you will. Trust your instincts and remember what she taught you. My siblings turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation, as if Mom had broken some unspoken rule by acknowledging that I might know something they didn't. What does that mean? Nathaniel demanded. What did she teach you that she didn't teach us? I didn't answer because I honestly wasn't sure yet. Mom had taught me thousands of things over the years we'd spent together, hours in her office while she explained her work, days helping her organize files and interviews. But which specific lesson applied to this challenge wasn't immediately clear. We left the attorney's office and regrouped in the building lobby, an impromptu strategy session that I wasn't invited to but attended through sheer proximity. Nathaniel was already on his phone making calls. I'm bringing in my AI team. We can digitize the entire archive in 48 hours and run pattern recognition algorithms to locate those 3 documents. Victoria was texting furiously. I know data forensics experts who can reconstruct filing systems from chaos. They've worked on criminal cases involving deliberately destroyed records. This is essentially the same challenge. Dominic was researching on his tablet, pulling up information about archival science and document retrieval methods. I'm hiring archivists who specialize in disorganized collections. They'll know the most efficient search methodologies. They all looked at me then, their successful accomplished sibling, wondering what strategy I could possibly employ with my limited resources and lack of sophisticated tools. What are you planning, Iris? Nathaniel asked with barely concealed condescension. Are you going to read through 847,000 documents one by one? Victoria at least tried for false sympathy. This is clearly designed for someone with archival expertise, but even you have to admit 72 hours isn't enough time without computational assistance. Maybe we should all pool our resources and split the inheritance. Dominic nodded. That's the logical approach. We work together, find the documents, divide the 12 million 4 ways. Everyone wins. I shook my head. Mom designed this as individual competition for a reason. She wanted to see who actually understood her work, not who could hire the best team. Besides, hiring help violates the terms. You'll be disqualified. Nathaniel's expression hardened. You think you can beat us? You're a municipal archivist making barely enough to afford rent. We have resources you can't imagine. I looked at my 3 siblings, at their expensive clothes and confident faces, at the phones and tablets they were using to coordinate their sophisticated strategies, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a quiet determination that had been building for years of being dismissed and underestimated. I'm going to remember what Mom actually valued. Remember what? Victoria's tone suggested she thought I'd already lost my mind. Mom's filing system isn't about sophisticated algorithms or pattern recognition. It's about understanding how she thought, what mattered to her, what she was trying to protect. They exchanged glances that clearly communicated their opinion that I was delusional. Nathaniel laughed and headed toward his rented Tesla. Good luck with your nostalgic approach, Iris. The rest of us will be using actual methodology. I drove to Mom's house in Brooklyn in my aging Nissan, the one with the cracked windshield I couldn't afford to replace, and parked in front of the brownstone where she'd lived for 37 years. The house looked exactly as it had during my last visit 3 weeks before her death, when we'd had dinner and she'd talked about her latest investigation into pharmaceutical companies suppressing adverse drug trial results. She'd seemed energized and focused, not someone whose brain was about to hemorrhage catastrophically. I opened the envelope at exactly 4 p.m., starting my 72-hour countdown. Inside were keys to the house and storage facility, access codes for her office, and a handwritten note in Mom's distinctive script. Iris, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're facing a challenge that your siblings will approach with technology and money. Don't. Everything you need to know, I already taught you. Think about the word I used when you were 7 years old, the secret password we created together. That word is the key to everything. The filing system is built around it. I love you and I'm proud of you. Trust yourself. I sat in the car staring at that note, feeling tears blur my vision because Mom had left me a message that confirmed what I'd suspected since Helena's reading. This wasn't really about finding 3 documents. It was about proving that the daughter who'd stayed close, who'd listened and learned and cared about the work itself rather than its monetary value, understood something essential that couldn't be purchased or computed. The secret password from when I was 7. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. I'd been in 2nd grade, struggling with a bully named Jeffrey who'd made my life miserable for months. Mom had picked me up from school one day and found me crying in the car, and instead of offering generic advice about standing up for myself, she'd done something unexpected. She'd taken me to her office and shown me her filing cabinets, explaining that sometimes the best way to defeat powerful people was to organize information they wanted to keep hidden. She'd taught me her system that afternoon, showing me how she categorized documents, how she cross-referenced evidence, how she created chains of proof that courts couldn't ignore. And she'd given me a secret password, a single word that represented the core of her entire philosophy about justice and truth. Starling. That was the word. Not the bird, but the name I'd given to my favorite stuffed animal, a small purple bird that Mom had bought me when I was 4. She'd asked me why I named it Starling instead of something like Tweety or Chirpy, and I'd said it was because starlings were small birds that people ignored, but they were actually incredibly smart and could mimic any sound. Mom had smiled and said, "That's exactly what we are, Iris. We're starlings. Small and overlooked, but capable of understanding and exposing any system if we pay close enough attention." I got out of the car and unlocked Mom's front door, stepping into the brownstone that smelled like her lavender tea and old paper. The house was exactly as she'd left it, coffee cup still in the sink, reading glasses on the kitchen table, her cardigan hanging on the back of a chair. I walked through the familiar rooms to her office in the back, a converted sunroom filled with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and 2 large desks covered in papers and notebooks. The surveillance cameras Helena had mentioned were visible in the corners, red lights blinking to indicate they were recording. I sat at Mom's main desk and looked at the apparent chaos surrounding me. Hundreds of filing cabinets, boxes stacked along walls, papers in seemingly random piles, notebooks without labels. To anyone else, it would look like decades of disorganization, but I was starting to see the pattern. If the system was built around the word starling, then I needed to think about what that word represented. Small birds that mimicked sounds. Overlooked creatures that were actually brilliant. The concept of hiding in plain sight by appearing ordinary. I opened the nearest filing cabinet and pulled out a random folder. Inside were documents about a 1992 pharmaceutical case, newspaper clippings, interview transcripts, and photographs. The folder itself had no label, but clipped to the inside was a small piece of paper with a handwritten notation. S3M. 3 characters that meant nothing to someone looking for traditional organizational systems, but everything to someone who understood Mom's philosophy. S for Starling. The 3 was a category number. M was a subcategory. I started pulling out more folders, checking their internal notations. Each one had a similar code, always starting with S, followed by numbers and letters that created a coordinate system. The filing cabinets weren't organized by date or subject or alphabetical order. They were organized by the Starling system, a method Mom had developed and had tried to teach all of us, but only I had actually learned. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathaniel sent to our sibling group chat. "I've got my team digitizing everything at the storage facility. We'll have a searchable database within 36 hours. This will be over by tomorrow night." Victoria responded immediately. "My forensics experts are analyzing document clustering patterns. They say most archivists unconsciously organize by temporal proximity. We're focusing on time periods matching the 3 cases." Dominic added his update. "I've hired 6 professional archivists at $300 per hour each. They're systematically cataloging Mom's collection using standard taxonomic methods. How's your nostalgic approach working, Iris?" I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I focused on understanding the numerical system Mom had used after the S designation. I pulled out my childhood journals that I'd brought from my apartment, pages where I'd practiced the filing system Mom had taught me when I was young. We'd created a game together, categorizing my school papers and art projects using the Starling code, treating it like a secret spy system that only we understood. The numbers corresponded to broad categories. 1 was financial crimes, 2 was pharmaceutical fraud, 3 was political corruption, 4 was environmental violations, 5 was labor exploitation. The letters that followed indicated subcategories within each number. M might be medical fraud, T could be tax evasion, P could be price fixing. The 3 documents I needed to find were S2M for the Whitmore pharmaceutical recording from 1987, S1P for Kenneth Ashford's pension fund confession from 2003, and S3C for Senator Dennings's bribery photographs from 2011. But knowing the codes wasn't enough. I still needed to figure out how Mom had arranged the physical storage locations. The filing cabinets in her office were labeled with letters rather than numbers, A through Z, which suggested a secondary organizational layer. I spent the next 3 hours mapping out the system, pulling folders from different cabinets and analyzing their codes until I understood the pattern. The cabinets were arranged alphabetically, but not by subject matter. They were arranged by the alphabet of the Starling Code's subcategory letters. Cabinet M would contain all documents coded with M subcategories, regardless of their primary number category. It was counterintuitive and would seem completely random to anyone trying to apply standard archival methods, but it made perfect sense within Mom's philosophy of hiding truth in plain sight. By 9 p.m., I'd located the first document. Cabinet M, Drawer 4, a folder containing cassette tapes from 1987. The Whitmore Pharmaceutical interview was the 7th tape in the folder, labeled only with S2M and a date. I played it on Mom's old cassette player to verify, hearing her voice from 37 years ago interviewing a whistleblower who described how the company had hidden cardiac medication side effects that later killed 63 people. The recording was damning and specific, featuring the whistleblower naming executives and detailing the cover-up with documentation references. I called Helena Marsh and told her I'd found the first document. She sounded surprised. Already? It's only been 5 hours since you opened the envelope. Should I bring it to your office now or wait until I have all three? Helena said I could bring them together at the end of the 72 hours or individually as I found them. I decided to keep searching, wanting to maintain momentum. My phone kept buzzing with updates from my siblings. Nathaniel reported that his AI team was making progress but encountering difficulties with the physical document's lack of metadata. Victoria admitted her forensics experts were frustrated by the apparent randomness of Mom's system. Dominic complained that his hired archivists were saying they'd never seen such a chaotic collection. None of them asked how I was doing, assuming I was failing quietly in some corner. I worked through the night, existing on coffee and determination, mapping out more of the Starling system. The Brooklyn storage facility was next, but I wanted to understand as much as possible before going there, knowing it contained hundreds of thousands of additional documents. Around 3 a.m., I found Mom's master notebook, a leather-bound journal hidden in her desk drawer beneath papers. It contained her complete Starling system documentation, 40 years of notes about how she'd organized her life's work. The pages were filled with her handwriting, codes and categories, references and cross-references, a guide that would have made finding the 3 documents trivially easy if I'd had it from the beginning. But wedged between the pages was another note. Iris, you found the notebook, which means you understand the system well enough to have gotten this far without it. The other 2 documents are in the Brooklyn facility in locations that match their codes, but the facility is organized differently. The cabinets there are numbered, not lettered, and they correspond to decades. Cabinet 1 is the 1980s, Cabinet 2 is the 1990s, Cabinet 3 is the 2000s, Cabinet 4 is the 2010s. The subcategory letters are marked inside each drawer. You're looking for document S1P in Cabinet 3 and document S3C in Cabinet 4. I love you. You're going to do important things with this archive. I drove to the Brooklyn storage facility at 4:30 a.m., exhausted but energized by the breakthrough. The facility was a warehouse in an industrial area, one of those anonymous buildings that stored everything from business records to personal collections. My access code opened the loading dock door, and I walked into a cavernous space filled with metal shelving units holding hundreds of bankers' boxes, file cabinets, and document storage containers. The surveillance cameras here were more numerous, tracking my movements as I navigated the aisles looking for Cabinet 3. I found it near the back, a large filing system with dozens of drawers. Following Mom's instructions, I located the drawer marked P and pulled it open. Inside were folders documenting financial crimes from the 2000s, pension fund scandals, Ponzi schemes, and corporate theft. The Kenneth Ashford confession was in a folder 2/3 of the way through the drawer, 3 pages of handwritten admission where he detailed how he deliberately collapsed a pension fund to enrich himself and 6 other executives, knowing it would destroy thousands of families' retirement savings. The document was notarized and witnessed, written the day before his federal trial began, when he'd apparently suffered a crisis of conscience. Mom had been the one to convince him to write it, spending hours talking to him about accountability and redemption. Cabinet 4 took longer to find because the warehouse organization wasn't perfectly linear, but I eventually located it near the front. The drawer marked C contained political corruption cases from the 2010s, documentation of bribes, kickbacks, and influence peddling. Senator Dennings's photographs were in an envelope marked only with S3C and a date, 12 images showing him accepting cash in what appeared to be a parking garage, the bills clearly visible, his face unmistakable in the harsh lighting. I had all 3 documents by 8 a.m. on Tuesday, 19 hours into my 72-hour countdown. I sat in my car outside the storage facility feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and vindication, knowing I'd succeeded at something my brilliant, accomplished siblings couldn't manage despite their vast resources and sophisticated tools. But I didn't go to Helena's office immediately. Something about Mom's note in the notebook bothered me. You're going to do important things with this archive. What did that mean? What important things? I drove back to Mom's house and spent the next several hours going through her recent files, the investigations she'd been working on before her death. What I found made my hands shake and my pulse accelerate. Mom had been investigating a network of pharmaceutical executives, politicians, and insurance companies who were systematically suppressing information about dangerous medications while bribing officials to prevent regulation. The investigation involved 15 companies, 32 executives, and 8 members of Congress. The documentation was extensive and damning, showing a pattern of corruption that had resulted in hundreds of deaths and thousands of severe adverse reactions that could have been prevented if the truth had been disclosed. But the investigation was incomplete. Mom's notes indicated she'd been days away from publishing a comprehensive exposé that would have destroyed careers and led to criminal prosecutions. She'd scheduled meetings with the New York Times and the Washington Post for the week after she died. The final piece of evidence she needed was a recorded admission from a pharmaceutical CEO named Douglas Rathmore, acknowledging that his company had deliberately hidden trial data showing their diabetes medication caused fatal cardiac events in 12% of users. Mom's notes said she'd scheduled an interview with him for the Monday she died. I started digging deeper into the timeline and found something that made my blood run cold. The medical examiner who'd ruled Mom's death a cerebral aneurysm was Dr. Calvin Northrop, whose name appeared in Mom's investigation files as someone receiving consulting fees from 3 of the pharmaceutical companies she was investigating. His financial disclosures showed payments totaling $340,000 over the previous 4 years, paid through a medical education foundation that was actually a front for corporate influence operations. The connection was clear enough to raise serious questions about whether Mom's death had been natural or whether someone had silenced her before she could expose them. I called Helena Marsh at 11 a.m., 27 hours into the countdown. I need to see you immediately. Not at your office, somewhere private. We need to talk about what Mom was investigating when she died. Helena agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Manhattan, arriving 30 minutes later with concern evident in her expression. What did you find? I showed her the files I'd pulled from Mom's investigation, the network of corruption, the suspicious timing, the medical examiner's financial connections. Helena's face went pale as she reviewed the documentation. Vivian told me she was close to exposing something massive, but she didn't provide details because she said it was safer if I didn't know too much. She asked me to make sure that if anything happened to her, her archive would go to someone who would continue her work. That's why she created the challenge. I stared at Helena, understanding crystallizing. She didn't make the challenge about finding 3 random documents from her career. She made it about finding 3 documents that proved I understood her filing system well enough to locate the current investigation files. She wanted whoever inherited the archive to be capable of finishing what she started. Helena nodded slowly. The challenge was never really about the inheritance money. It was about finding someone who could be trusted with 40 years of evidence and who had the skills to use it effectively. Your siblings would have sold the archive or donated it to a university where it would sit untouched. You'll actually do something with it. I felt the weight of responsibility settling over me, understanding that Mom had left me not just $12 million, but an obligation to complete her final investigation and expose the network that might have killed her. Do I have legal standing to request a second autopsy? Can we investigate whether her death was actually natural? Helena considered the question. We'd need probable cause for exhumation, which means building a case that her death was suspicious. The medical examiner's financial ties might be enough, but you'd need more evidence of motive and opportunity. I spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday going through Mom's investigation files, building my understanding of the corruption network and what she'd discovered. The pattern was chilling in its systematic nature. Pharmaceutical companies would develop medications with known dangerous side effects, hide the adverse trial data, bribe officials to expedite approval, pay doctors to prescribe the drugs, and suppress information about deaths and injuries until legal liability forced recalls. The cycle repeated across multiple companies and medications, suggesting coordination rather than isolated incidents. Mom had traced the connections to a consulting firm called Viridian Health Strategies, which operated as a coordination hub for the entire network. Viridian's executives moved between pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies, and political offices, creating a revolving door that ensured continued protection for dangerous practices. Douglas Rathmore, the CEO Mom had scheduled to interview, was a founding partner in Viridian and had been involved in at least 8 medication scandals over 20 years. If Mom had gotten his recorded admission, it would have exposed the entire network and led to criminal prosecutions across the industry. I found Mom's interview preparation notes from her last days, questions she'd planned to ask Rathmore, strategies for getting him to admit culpability. She'd been confident he would crack under pressure because she'd accumulated evidence of his direct involvement in decisions that killed people. The interview had been scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. at a hotel near his office. Mom had died at 3:47 a.m. that same Monday, 6 hours before the interview. The timing was extraordinarily suspicious, but proving murder would require evidence I didn't have. My siblings finally began to realize they were failing at the challenge. Nathaniel called Wednesday afternoon, 39 hours into my countdown, sounding frustrated and exhausted. The AI analysis isn't working. Mom's system doesn't follow any recognizable pattern. We've processed 340,000 documents and found nothing relevant. How are you doing this? I didn't tell him I'd already found all 3 documents. Instead, I asked him what he remembered about the word starling, whether Mom had ever explained what it meant to her, whether he'd ever paid attention to the filing system she tried to teach us. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. What does starling have to do with anything? Everything. It's the key to her entire archive, the organizing principle she built over 40 years. She tried to teach you, but you were always too busy. Victoria called an hour later, her lawyer precision cracking into something close to panic. I'm at 67 hours and I haven't found a single document. My experts are saying this collection is unsearchable without an index. Iris, if you know something, please tell me. We're family. I felt a flash of anger at that last statement, the sudden invocation of family loyalty from someone who'd spent decades treating me with condescension. Where was family loyalty when you dismissed my career choices? When you made jokes about my income? When you acted like my life was less valuable because I didn't make millions? Victoria's voice became cold. So this is revenge? You're going to win out of spite? I'm going to win because I spent time with Mom learning what she actually cared about instead of just calculating inheritance values. There's a difference. Dominic sent a text at hour 64. I've spent $72,000 on archivists and gotten nowhere. This challenge is impossible. Mom must have known no one could solve it. She created it to force us to fail. I didn't respond because the opposite was true. Mom had created the challenge knowing exactly one person could solve it, and she'd spent decades preparing me for this moment. Thursday morning at hour 70, I drove to Helena's office with all 3 documents in a secure folder. My siblings were there waiting, summoned by Helena for the resolution of the challenge. They looked exhausted and defeated, expensive clothes rumpled, expressions showing the strain of 72 hours failing at something they'd expected to master easily. Helena asked if anyone had successfully located the 3 documents. Nathaniel, Victoria, and Dominic all shook their heads, admitting failure. Helena looked at me. Iris? I placed the folder on the conference table and opened it to reveal the Whitmore pharmaceutical recording, Kenneth Ashford's confession, and Senator Dennings's bribery photographs. I found them all within 20 hours of opening the envelope. The room went silent. My siblings stared at the documents with expressions of disbelief and dismay, unable to process how I'd succeeded where they'd failed despite their superior resources and intelligence. How? Nathaniel finally asked, the word barely a whisper. How did you find them when our AI couldn't? I explained the Starling system, the code Mom had created when I was 7, the filing structure she'd tried to teach all of them, but only I had learned. I described how she'd organized by concept rather than chronology, by philosophy rather than subject matter, creating a system that required understanding her values to navigate effectively. Victoria was crying, real tears that seemed to surprise her. She taught me too when I was younger, but I stopped paying attention because I thought it was childish. I chose law school and career advancement instead of listening to her stories about justice and truth. Dominic stood and walked to the window, looking out at Manhattan with his back to us. I told her I was too busy to visit last Christmas. She asked me to come help organize some recent files, and I said I had meetings in Tokyo that were more important than playing with old papers. That was the last time I talked to her. Helena cleared her throat and began the formal process of transferring the archive ownership to me. Iris Reeves, you have successfully completed Vivian Reeves's challenge and are hereby granted full ownership of her personal archive, all associated assets, and the $12.3 million valuation. Congratulations. My siblings left the office without speaking to me. 3 brilliant, accomplished people who'd learned that success in business didn't translate to understanding what actually mattered. I stayed behind with Helena and told her about my plan to continue Mom's investigation, to finish exposing the pharmaceutical corruption network, to potentially investigate whether her death had been natural. Helena pulled out another folder, this one marked with my name. Vivian left this for you specifically, to be provided only after you won the challenge. She said you'd know what to do with it. Inside was a complete backup of Mom's investigation files, organized and annotated, along with a letter written 2 weeks before her death. Iris, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've proven you understand my life's work well enough to inherit it. What I'm about to tell you needs to stay confidential until you decide how to proceed. I believe I'm in danger. The Viridian Health investigation has generated threats that feel different from the usual corporate intimidation. I've made arrangements to protect the evidence, but I want you to know that if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Douglas Rathmore called me last week and told me that continuing this investigation would have consequences I couldn't imagine. I recorded the call and it's in the archive under code S2T for pharmaceutical threats. Use it however you think is right. The letter continued with specific instructions about journalists Mom trusted, attorneys who specialized in whistleblower cases, investigators who could examine potential foul play. She'd essentially prepared a roadmap for exposing her own possible murder while finishing her final investigation. I spent the next week working with Helena to secure the archive, moving everything to a private storage facility with enhanced security, creating digital backups, and establishing legal protections against seizure or suppression. Then I contacted the journalists Mom had identified, starting with a senior investigative reporter at the New York Times named Rachel Okonkwo, who'd worked with Mom on previous exposures. Rachel listened to my summary of the Viridian Health investigation and Mom's suspicious death, reviewing the evidence files with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades building cases against powerful entities. This is explosive, but we need more than documentary evidence. We need someone inside Viridian willing to testify, or we need Douglas Rathmore's recorded admission that your mother never got. Can you get either? I thought about that question and realized I might be able to accomplish what Mom hadn't, because Rathmore didn't know I existed in any meaningful way. He'd threatened Mom specifically, but he had no reason to be guarded around her unknown daughter who worked as a municipal archivist. I spent 3 weeks researching Rathmore's patterns, learning his schedule, identifying opportunities for contact. He attended a pharmaceutical industry conference in Boston in late November, and I registered as an attendee using my professional credentials as an archivist, claiming research interest in medical records preservation. I engineered a casual conversation with him at a networking reception, introducing myself as someone studying how pharmaceutical companies maintained long-term documentation for legal compliance. Rathmore was charming and personable, exactly the kind of executive who could authorize covering up deaths while maintaining a friendly public persona. We talked for 20 minutes about archival challenges, and I mentioned I'd recently inherited a collection of pharmaceutical industry documents from a deceased relative. His expression shifted slightly, interest sharpening. What relative? What kind of documents? I kept my voice casual. My mother was a journalist who covered pharmaceutical issues. Vivian Reeves. Maybe you knew her? The change in Rathmore was immediate and dramatic. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. I knew Vivian. She died recently, didn't she? Very sudden and tragic. I maintained eye contact. The medical examiner said cerebral aneurysm, but I've been going through her investigation files and I'm starting to wonder if there were other factors. Rathmore's smile was thin and dangerous. What are you implying? That someone deliberately caused her death? That sounds like paranoid conspiracy thinking. I shrugged, playing the naive archivist who didn't fully understand what she'd inherited. Maybe. But she was scheduled to interview you the day she died, and her notes suggest she had evidence about medication safety data being suppressed. Just seems coincidental. Rathmore leaned closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Let me give you some advice, Miss Reeves. Your mother was a brilliant journalist, but she didn't understand the complexities of pharmaceutical development and regulatory approval. Sometimes medications have side effects that emerge post-market, and companies have to make difficult decisions about risk-benefit ratios. That's not corruption, that's business reality. And sometimes journalists who can't accept that reality create problems for themselves. I felt ice run down my spine at the implicit threat, but I kept my expression neutral. What kind of problems? The kind where they end up dying suddenly before they can publish damaging allegations that would hurt companies and their shareholders. The kind where families who might be tempted to continue crusades on behalf of deceased journalists might find themselves facing similar health crises. Do you understand what I'm saying, Miss Reeves? I understood perfectly. I also understood that the small recording device I'd hidden in my conference badge was capturing every word. I understand that you're threatening me the same way you threatened my mother. Rathmore's eyes narrowed. I didn't threaten your mother. I warned her about consequences. There's a difference. Consequences like cerebral aneurysms in otherwise healthy women, like medical examiners who receive hundreds of thousands in consulting fees ruling deaths natural without thorough investigation. Rathmore grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. You need to drop this immediately. Donate your mother's archive to a university and walk away. If you continue digging into Viridian's business, you'll regret it. I pulled my arm free and stepped back. I'm recording this conversation. Everything you just said is captured on audio. If anything happens to me, copies of this recording and my mother's complete investigation files go to the New York Times, Washington Post, FBI, and Justice Department simultaneously. Rathmore's face went pale with fury. You're making a serious mistake. No, you made a serious mistake when you threatened a journalist who dedicated her life to exposing corruption, and an even bigger mistake threatening her daughter who inherited 40 years of evidence documenting pharmaceutical industry crimes. I walked away from him and left the reception, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. The recording was everything Rachel Okonkwo needed to publish the investigation. Combined with Mom's documentary evidence about Viridian Health's corruption network and Rathmore's admission of threatening Mom before her death, we had grounds for criminal investigation. The New York Times published the story in early January, a comprehensive exposé spanning multiple articles that detailed the systematic suppression of medication safety data, the bribery of officials, and the network of executives who'd coordinated the cover-ups. Rathmore's recorded threat went viral online, played repeatedly on news programs, analyzed by legal experts who called it the most damning corporate admission since the tobacco industry trials. Federal prosecutors opened investigations into Viridian Health, 14 pharmaceutical companies, and 8 members of Congress. The FBI launched a separate investigation into Mom's death, examining whether Dr. Calvin Northrup had falsified autopsy results and whether Rathmore had been involved in arranging her murder. The exhumation happened in February, and the second autopsy revealed trace amounts of pharmaceutical compounds in Mom's brain tissue that were consistent with induced aneurysm, a rare but documented method of assassination using medications that created catastrophic vascular events while leaving minimal evidence. Dr. Northrup was arrested in March for falsifying medical examiner reports and receiving bribes to cover up suspicious deaths. He eventually cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony that Rathmore had paid him $500,000 to rule Mom's death natural and to ensure no thorough investigation occurred. Douglas Rathmore was arrested in April and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, threatening witnesses, bribery, and multiple counts related to pharmaceutical fraud. His trial began in September and lasted 7 weeks, featuring testimony from whistleblowers, victims' families, and former Veridian executives who turned state's evidence to reduce their own sentences. I testified about the Boston Conference conversation and Mom's investigation files, presenting 40 years of evidence showing systematic corruption. The jury convicted Rathmore on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 47 years in federal prison, specifically citing the murder conspiracy as deserving the maximum penalty. In her sentencing statement, Judge Angela Morrison said that Rathmore represented the worst kind of corporate criminal who valued profit over human life and who'd eliminated someone dedicated to exposing truth. 14 other executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years. The congressional members involved lost their seats in the following election, with several facing their own criminal charges. The pharmaceutical companies paid combined settlements totaling $3.2 billion to victims and families, the largest such settlement in industry history. My siblings reached out after the trial concluded, all three sending carefully worded messages expressing admiration for what I'd accomplished and regret for how they'd treated me. Nathaniel's email acknowledged that he'd fundamentally misunderstood what intelligence meant, that he'd valued computational ability over human wisdom. Victoria admitted she'd spent her career winning legal battles while I'd actually achieved justice. Dominic said he'd been managing money while I'd been protecting lives, and that he finally understood the difference. I appreciated their words but didn't forgive immediately because forgiveness required more than acknowledgement of mistakes. It required changed behavior over time. We established cautious contact, monthly dinners where we tried to rebuild relationships damaged by decades of dismissal and condescension. Progress was slow but genuine. I used the $12 million inheritance to establish the Vivian Reeves Foundation for Investigative Journalism, funding reporters working on stories about corporate corruption, pharmaceutical fraud, and systemic injustice. The foundation provided grants, legal support, and archival resources to journalists continuing the work Mom had dedicated her life to. Dr. Rachel Okonkwo became the foundation's first director, bringing her investigative expertise to identifying and supporting crucial reporting projects. The archive itself became a research resource for journalists, lawyers, and investigators, organized using Mom's Starling system, which I taught to archival staff. We digitized everything while maintaining the physical documents, creating a searchable database that preserved Mom's organizational philosophy while making the evidence accessible to people who needed it. Universities requested permission to study the collection, and we granted access while maintaining control over how the materials were used. 5 years after Mom's death, I stood in the Foundation's headquarters in Manhattan, a renovated building that housed her complete archive along with offices for journalists, researchers, and legal staff. The opening ceremony attracted 200 people, including reporters Mom had mentored, families of victims whose cases she'd exposed, and prosecutors who'd used her evidence to secure convictions. My siblings attended, standing together at the back of the room, and for the first time in decades, I felt like we might actually become a real family again. During my speech, I explained that the Foundation's mission was simple: to continue asking the questions powerful people wanted buried, to organize evidence they tried to destroy, and to remember that truth mattered more than profit. Mom had spent 40 years building the archive not for wealth but for justice, and she'd designed her final challenge to ensure it went to someone who understood that distinction. The real inheritance wasn't $12 million or a collection of documents. It was the responsibility to use information as a weapon against corruption, to be a starling, small and overlooked but capable of exposing any system through careful attention and persistent courage. I promised to honor that inheritance for the rest of my life, to finish not just her final investigation but to continue her entire life's work, protecting people from powerful entities that valued profit over human dignity. The archive would remain a permanent resource, free and accessible, ensuring that Mom's 4 decades of fighting for justice would empower others to do the same for generations to come. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.